December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
Welcome to the H-Files. James Mundy here with my Liberty Monks co-host, Mike Mundy. How are you tonight, brother Mike?
I am super amped. How are you?
I'm doing great, and this is going to be a lot of fun. Joining us as well from across the pond in the UK is author John Hamer. How are you tonight, Mr. Hamer?
I'm good, thanks, guys. Thanks for inviting me on again. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. And so, like I said, you know, Mike and I have our show Liberty Monks, but we thought this would be a ton of fun based on how incredibly knowledgeable you are about history and all the things associated with it, and also science as well. We thought, well, gosh, it'd be a lot of fun to do a series with you on just some of the historical things that, you know, might not be as true as we thought. So, I guess we should explain what are the H-Files, right? So the H-Files, what we're going to do is, like I said, we're going to take a deeper dive into some of the things that some people would consider to be lies or untrue. Some of the falsifications, fabrications, I guess, that we've all been told is kind of our historical record, right? So we can investigate conspiracies, speculations, and most importantly, I think the evidence, right, John and Mike, just all the evidence that's out there that challenges some things we've been told about our history being what it is today.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as you guys are already know, and most of the viewers watching this will already know, that most of history is just not as they tell it. It is a different story to the one that's generally acceptable. And I mean, I'm saying that all history is false, because obviously certain events did really happen. It's just the way that they happened and the reasons why they happened that are come into question, really. So that's been my job for the last 20 years, investigating all that stuff and trying to wheedle out the real truth from the lies, basically.
Well, and that's why you're our subject matter expert on this stuff. And you're an author, so you've done a ton of research to put these books together, and a lot of the books that you've written really challenge the status quo of our recorded history, right? So and I want to mention these so that everybody listening also understands where they can find these resources and read about the things that you've done. Countless hours that you've put together and just organizing all this information must have been a lot of work, but it's done in a way where it's very, very easy to see the evidence kind of unfold. So, John, I'll give you a lot of credit. You do a phenomenal job of writing, my friend.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So you have a new book out, right, John? It's called Welcome to the Masquerade. And I know that's a run that you were telling us about in the last time we spoke, which I'm super excited to read. You've also written The Falsification of History, The Falsification of Science, JFK, A Very British Coup, and that's an awesome read for everybody out there who is fascinated with the JFK story. A lot of great evidence there. And actually, the highlight of what we're going to be talking about today is revolved around the RMS Olympic, right? And so I'd put a question mark after that, because until I started looking into your work, I didn't really even know what the RMS Olympic was. And so a lot of people would ask, well, what is that? And it's an excellent question. So I'm going to ask that question to you, my friend, because you're, again, subject matter, and you're the one who's going to be able to give us the best insight into this. Yeah. What was the RMS Olympic?
Right. Well, yeah, that's a great intro. Thank you. For those out there, excuse me, by the way, I must say to everyone that I'm suffering from a bit of a cold tonight. My throat's a bit rough, so I will be taking copious sips of water. So please do bear with me.
Yep, no worries. It's just, that's just the deal, right?
So you asked the question, what was RMS Olympic? Well, RMS Olympic is first of all, it's the title of one of my books about the Titanic. Why is it RMS Olympic? Called RMS Olympic? Well, we'll see. Now, let's start at the very beginning here. Everyone knows the Titanic story, or thinks that they do. Okay. I did about 3 years solid research into the Titanic. That's because I was always fascinated by the story ever since childhood. It just seemed so surreal and unbelievable to me. So hence I decided to look into it further, because it just seemed to fit into all the other possible conspiracies out there about history and what really happened. So yeah, I did about 3 years research between 2010 and 2013 in total. I looked into things like there were 2 public inquiries after the Titanic incident. There was the British inquiry, which was followed on from the American inquiry. Okay, so the inquiries took place, official inquiries took place in both countries. So I looked at the transcripts of the inquiry, and that tells a totally different story to the one that we're all led to believe for a start. I looked into the public records for Holland and Wolff shipyard, which was the shipyard in Belfast in Northern Ireland, where the ships were built. Various different archives. I went to several different libraries, looked at contemporary newspaper reports, which again tell a very, very different story to the one that we're told. Okay, obviously use the internet, the ubiquitous internet. And I also looked at the Marconi wireless transcripts, which are not available on the internet. They are only available at a place in Oxford, England, called the Bodleian Library, which is a massive library, and it contains lots and lots of different archives. Now, the Marconi wireless transcripts give an more accurate picture of what really happened, because in those days, those far off days, 110 years ago it is now, there was no radio as such. They had what was called wireless, but there was no voice wireless. It was almost Morse code, and all the ship's wireless operators, they were not employed by the shipping lines themselves. They were employed by the Marconi company, and Marconi farmed these people out to all the different shipping lines, obviously at a cost to them. So the transcripts from that night on the North Atlantic included just about every ship that was on the water that night, and there were dozens upon dozens upon dozens of them. But we're only going to be concentrating on 3 specific ones. Okay, but I'll come on to that as we tell the story. Now, it's a very, very, as I say, different story, and it's quite complex in parts, and there are 2 threads to it. Okay, so I'll try and keep it making sense, but please excuse me if it gets a bit confusing, but it will all get tied up at the end anyway. So I'll do my best with it. So let's start right at the beginning. Okay, well, first of all, let's just say a little bit about the incident. Okay, but that happened at 11:40 p.m. local time on Sunday the 14th of April 1912, and it sank at approximately 2:20 a.m. So it stayed, after the incident, it stayed afloat for about 2 hours 40 minutes in total, and it sank on in the early hours of Monday the 15th of April, again local time. So now the official story that's survived for decades upon decades and is always the subject of all these films that we see about the Titanic and documentaries, it's all actually based upon a book written by someone by the name of Walter Lord, who was a CIA agent in the early 1950s, late 1940s, early 1950s. And it was the story that he wrote was called A Night to Remember. Now, Night to Remember was made into a film, and that became the go-to version of the Titanic story. But to me, it always begged the question to me, what on earth was a CIA agent doing writing a story about a shipwreck that had taken place 40 years earlier? And yeah, and distorting all the facts too. And the facts were distorted, as we shall see as we go through it. It was all rather strange to me, and my inquisitive head led me to looking into this further. as I say, there are two strands to the story, but I'll begin in 1908 when the story really begins. A guy by the name of, excuse me, J.P. Morgan, whose name still lives on today in the name of the financial organization. He was head of that huge conglomerate corporation of that same name at that time, and he was also the ultimate owner of the White Star shipping line, to which Titanic belonged. And he decided to kind of buck the trend, if you like, because what he decided was, up until that point, and don't forget at this point in time that there was lots and lots of immigrant ships from Europe crossing the Atlantic to build a new life in the States. There were, you know, thousands upon thousands of immigrants pouring into America at that time. And so he decided to buck the trend, and he decided to go against the flow, and the flow had been to sell, for the various shipping lines, to sell their tickets and advertise their services based on speed. Okay, so it was like a race, if you like. Now he decided to go a completely different way, because he wasn't a stupid man. You know, he had some great innovative ideas, and he decided to build 3 luxury liners with a mandate of becoming the most luxurious in the world. So concentrate on the luxury angle rather than the speed angle. Now those 3 ships were the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. Now they were designed to be identical, almost, but not quite identical. So he commissioned Harland and Wolff Belfast, Harland and Wolff Shipyard in Belfast, to commence construction of the 3 twin sisters, or the 3 triplet sisters, in 1908. Now, this is an important aspect to this, and this needs to be borne in mind as you're listening to this story. Okay, there was a massive investment of money needed, and this was all financed by JP personally, and it was a huge gamble. Okay, the plan depended on absolutely everything going exactly to plan, but unfortunately for Morgan, as we'll see, the whole enterprise was beset with problems, ultimately ending in tragedy, of course, right from the beginning. So RMS Olympic, which is what you were mentioning earlier, was the first of the sisters to be built. It was the first off the production line, if you like. It wasn't exactly a production line, but you get the idea. And that was launched in 1911, which was about a year before Titanic. Now, the problem that Morgan had almost immediately was that she had several serious accidents, 4 in all, even before, and this was all before the launch of the Titanic. So in other words, during the first few months of her life, she was involved in 4 accidents, 3 relatively minor ones, but still serious, and 4, as we shall see, the 4th one was the real killer. Okay, first of all, on a maiden voyage from Southampton to New York, she destroyed a tug in New York Harbor on a maiden voyage. White Star Line was sued, and they had to pay a substantial amount of money. Doesn't sound a lot these days, but it was $10,000. Okay, which,
well, back then that was a lot of money.
At that time, it was a lot of money. Yeah. Fortunately, there were no deaths. A couple of people had minor injuries, but there was nothing serious about it really. But it destroyed the tug. And then later on, it ran over a sunken wreck at Sandy Hook, a famous name, that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Whilst leaving New York, and it caused severe damage to its propellers. And it returned back across the Atlantic at around half speed. But as a result of the collision, it suffered further vibrational damage due to the imbalance caused by the propellers not functioning correctly. And 2 propellers had to be replaced. So they had to take it out of commission for a couple of weeks, replace the propellers. So again, Morgan's losing money here. He's had to take the ship out of service. She's not paying away. You know, it's costing him thousands and thousands of dollars. And as I say, in those days, it was a lot of money. Shortly after that, it hit a sandbank, ran aground, and actually threw a propeller. That means the propeller actually fell off. This also had to be replaced, but having used both spares already, they had to borrow one from the Titanic, which was still under construction. Now, this is significant, and I'll return to that point later in the story. So yeah, I'll try and remember that when I get to the end, and we'll talk about that when we get to talk about the aftermath. Right, but the fourth accident, this was the real serious one. In September 1911, Olympic was involved in a massive high-speed collision with a British Navy battleship called HMS Hawke, and this is known in Titanic circles as the Hawke incident. After leaving Southampton Water, just off the south coast of England, and preparing to turn westwards, travelling clockwise around the Isle of Wight. Now, the Isle of Wight is just at the entrance to Southampton Harbour, and it had to go kind of slightly east and then around the Isle of Wight to go back west again. So it was just off the coast of the Isle of Wight, and it hit HMS Hawke, or should I say HMS Hawke actually hit it. It limped back to Southampton docks to be patched up. The patch up alone took 2 weeks, and then it had to go back to Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast for full repairs, because there was no dry dock in the world big enough to take this ship, because at this point in time that ship was the biggest ship in the world. And once they got it back into the dry dock, it was realized that she was in a far worse shape than they originally thought. And worse still for them and JP Morgan's bank balance, the Royal Navy inquiry into the accident found Olympic's crew, and therefore the White Star Line, culpable. It was their fault. Okay. So White Star was not only liable for millions of pounds of expenses, millions of dollars of expenses for repairs to both ships, but it was also then suffered a significant loss of revenues again whilst Olympic was out of action. So at this point, JP Morgan was falling into a massive money pit. Now, the problem that Olympic had, amongst many other relatively minor issues, the major problem was that Olympic's keel was bent and distorted out of shape, and the repairs were estimated to cost more than to build a new ship from scratch. Now, I spoke to, during the course of my research, I spoke to several mariners, and they all said that a twisted or bent keel is a total wreck. Okay. So White Star now realized that Olympic was damaged beyond economic repair. Significantly, she was also now uninsurable. She was therefore an insurance write-off, and White Star Line had no option at that point but to declare her officially as a wreck. And that actually did happen. It's documented. White Star Line declared RMS Olympic a wreck. Okay, so in other words, all it was fit for was the scrapyard. And documents, as I say, prove this to be the truth.
So completely dilapidated, right? Completely dilapidated and not seaworthy.
Yeah, it's like, it's just imagine if you're in a car wreck and, you know, the insurance company believe that it's not economically worthwhile to repair your car, so they'll just pay you what they believe it's worth.
They'll total it, yeah.
But unfortunately, Olympic, because it was deemed to be their fault, they weren't insured. So this was now turning into a really serious problem for Morgan and the White Star Line. Okay, I mean, so of course, due to this serious damage, she wasn't able to ply a trade back and forth across the Atlantic, and was in nowhere even close to beginning to pay her way. So the bankruptcy of White Star and Harland and Wolff as well, because if White Star had gone down, then Harland and Wolff would have gone down as well, because Harland and Wolff built ships exclusively for White Star Line. Okay, so yeah, at this point then Morgan and his co-conspiracies, I believe, hatched a plan to kill two birds with one stone, which would solve the White Star financial problems. And also, and this is where the second strand of the story comes in, excuse me a second, sorry. And the second strand to the story is to remove opposition to the plans for the Federal Reserve Bank. So they would kill two birds with one stone and solve both problems in one simple move. Now, I'll come on back onto the Federal Reserve thing shortly, but let's just talk a little bit more about the damage and, you know, the consequences of that. So the plan involved patching up the wrecked Olympic as best they could, and bracing the twisted keel with metal struts just to make a temporary repair. Because it's significant that when Robert Ballard, who allegedly discovered the Titanic wreck in 1986, he actually didn't, but that's another story, that they'd known all along exactly where it was. So Ballard didn't discover it. He was puzzled to find these struts in the wreck, which were supporting the keel and which, of course, didn't appear on the construction blueprints. Now, it's possible to actually see the repairs to Olympic superstructure and steel plates in some pictures, allegedly of Titanic prior to the maiden voyage. There are even videos existing where you can clearly see a ship, which is supposed to be the Titanic, but is in actual fact the Olympic, with all the repairs to the superstructure completely obvious. So, you know, I guess everyone out there now can guess where this was going. This has set the scene for a remarkable and elaborate scam.
The old switcheroo.
Yeah, one so incredible that if I'd not seen this evidence with, you know, for myself, I just wouldn't have believed it. Okay, so they decided to switch the identity of the two ships. They almost completed Titanic and they almost wrecked Olympic. And this fact is corroborated by many Belfast ship workers' families who've had the story passed down to them through their families. As part of my research, I actually put an ad in the Belfast Evening Telegraph, the newspaper, asking for interviews with families of people who'd worked on the two ships. And 3 people answered my ad and agreed to meet me. So I went over there to Belfast and I spoke to them, and all 3, although they didn't know each other and these were separate meetings, all 3 families said exactly the same thing, that their grandfather or father or whatever it was had told them that the ships had been switched, and that if they ever breathed a word of it outside the dock gates, then neither they nor their families would ever work again. Not just for Harland and Wolff, but anywhere, because in those days it was so easy to do that. Yeah.
It was a small world back then. A lot of the people owned a lot of the things, right?
Exactly. So this obviously begs the question: well, how did they manage to pull this off? How was it carried out? Okay. So after Olympic's accident with the battleship Hawke, she spent many weeks in the shipyard at Belfast, and the changes were made bit by bit, piecemeal, and they were often moored together side by side. You know, nobody was looking for a switch, so you know the dockyard workers would be just getting on with their jobs. Most of the people didn't know that this was going on, obviously, and over a period of time, over a period of a couple of months, there were differences, slight differences between the Titanic and the Olympic, but only in as much as that the Titanic was meant to be an improvement on the Olympic. Okay, so they were the same shape, the same size, and everything. So most of the changes were cosmetic. So what they did was they began to slowly eradicate the differences between the two ships, making them as identical as possible. Although it was not 100% practical and viable. And this, of course, is how the plots have been discovered, through meticulous research, because they weren't totally identical. There were certain aspects of it where they were different. And this has led to photos, which are taken at various stages and show them in various stages of transition. And it's actually possible to use the photos to prove that the switch was made. And then on one final weekend, by the way, all those photographs, or a lot of those photographs, appear in my book, RMS Olympic, which is the real Titanic story. And then on one final weekend, the last changes were made, and all that was done was the lifeboats, the menus and letterheads in the lounges, and of course the ship's nameplates. This was just carried out by a small crew of insiders, and these men were paid £100, which doesn't sound very much money. It's about $130. But that was a month's wages. Sorry, it was a year's wages in those days. Yeah, okay. So these guys were paid to keep quiet, and they were also threatened, as I say, with the loss of livelihood in event of their spilling the beans in any way. So, interestingly enough, again, this is some circumstantial evidence for what I've just said. Olympic's maiden voyage in June 1911, I looked at all the contemporary newspaper reports. Virtually, there are little bits of mentions of it, but nothing major at all. It's just very, the odd column inch here and there. And yet Titanic, which was actually the second one off the line,
Yep.
which was launched in December 1911, it was a massive fanfare for her maiden voyage. And again, I'll come on to the reason for that very shortly. So why would they reserve all this hoo-ha for a ship that is the second one off the production line? I'll come back to that.
Gotcha.
Okay. Now, as I say, there are so many conflicting photographs of the two in various stages of both official and unofficial changes that even so-called Titanic experts struggle to separate the two. And of course, most photos have no dates on them. And if surreptitious changes were being made alongside official ones, then the conclusion has to be that photos prove nothing at all. However, there are certain photographs and videos, actually, a couple of videos, that can't absolutely 100% prove that there's a switch just by that alone, but it's a lot of circumstantial evidence. And as I say, in my book, RMS Olympic, there's a series of photographs that I believe do prove the switch. Okay. Now, in those days, all passenger ships that were registered in the UK, at least, had to have something called a Board of Trade certificate of seaworthiness. And this involved a sea trial on open seas, involving stopping, starting, turning circles, maneuverability, adequate number of lifeboats, etc., etc. It was a whole day of a job, basically. Now, interestingly enough, Olympics was exactly that. When Olympic was launched, it had to go through this trial, and that took an entire day. Okay, on the open sea.
Okay.
Now, interestingly enough, when Titanic, and this is where it might get a little bit confusing, because when Titanic went through her certificate of seaworthiness trials, it wasn't the Titanic, it was the Olympic again, only this time
damaged.
It only took 2 hours. Okay, yeah. So there was something underhanded going on there. I think the Board of Trade inspector was being bought off at this point. And
so typically it's an all-day thing, and this was just 2 hours. Okay, gotcha.
I'm sure the damaged ship would have failed any kind of testing, so they had to pencil whip it through. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, it would have failed if it had been a genuine test. It would absolutely have failed, because it was a virtual wreck. It had for a start, and several passengers and crew actually made comment on it, and it had a very heavy list to port. Okay, and gotcha. Right through its alleged maiden voyage, of course it wasn't its maiden voyage because it wasn't Titanic, but it had a very heavy list to port. Now, so on Wednesday the 10th of April 1912, Titanic left Southampton on its maiden voyage for New York amidst huge celebrations. And it called a place called Cherbourg in France and Queenstown in Ireland, with 2,200 passengers and crew on board. Now, interestingly enough, it was only half full. People think, oh yeah, it was absolutely packed to the rafters. Everybody was clamoring to get on Titanic, and indeed they were, but they were turning people away. Why? Well, I believe it was to make the rescue operation manageable. And again, I'll come on to that in more detail.
Well, that's not a detail that you see. That's not a detail that you see in the movies. The big Titanic movie. Like, oh, I mean, they may make it sound like the ship is packed to the rafters, right?
That's absolutely right. Yeah, no, it was only half full. And interestingly enough, the transit crew, and by the transit crew I mean the actual crew of White Star sailors and all the staff aboard the ship, who were responsible for the safe passage of the liner from Belfast to Southampton before the maiden voyage. So getting it from where it was built to its first port of call, where it was going to take on board all its passengers. The crew that took that down only 2 crew signed on for the maiden voyage. Now, this is particularly significant because at that time, and again, this is something else that's not made particularly widely known, was that for the past 6 weeks in Britain, there'd been a huge coal strike. Now, what did liners run on in those days? They were steamers, they ran on coal.
Yep.
Titanic needed, or Olympic needed 10,000 tons of coal to cross the Atlantic once. Okay, so a one-way trip. Yeah, a one-way trip across the Atlantic took 10,000 tons of coal. Okay, now bearing in mind there's a coal strike, lots of liners have been laid up and lying empty, and as I say, by the day of Titanic sailing, the coal strike had been ongoing for 6 weeks. Lots of seamen were out of work, especially in towns like Southampton, where most of these guys lived. Any major ports around the country, thousands of people were out of work because there was no coal to fill the liners. But yet somehow Titanic managed to get enough. And in addition to that, of course, passengers were desperate for berths across the Atlantic because they were trying to get across to either for business reasons or to see friends and family or whatever, just like today, where you fly, except the only way to get across the Atlantic in those days was by ship. So people were clamoring for berths on ships. And when they tried to get on board the Titanic, first-class passengers were only offered second-class berths. And in those days, what self-respecting first-class passenger would stoop so low as to accept a second-class berth? Well, they just didn't. So, they were deliberately putting them off and keeping the numbers manageable. Now, interestingly enough as well, 5 days before Titanic sailed, a much smaller ship called the Californian had departed for New York from London, again in the midst of this nationwide coal strike and shortage, with no passengers whatsoever. Okay, so again, no passengers were allowed on, despite this huge demand for transatlantic passages. And it had, interestingly enough, no cargo except for 3,000 woolen sweaters and 3,000 woolen blankets. In fact, as I said, Titanic sailed only half full when there's such a huge demand. And so Californian leaves 5 days before. It only had half the speed of Titanic. So 10 days later, Titanic was almost at the ice field where it came to grief, and Californian had just reached it. This was the evening of the 14th of April, 1912. Californian stopped dead in the middle of the ice field where Titanic was due to pass shortly, and it drifted with the ice while keeping all its boilers fully fired. Now, 3 experienced transatlantic sea captains gave evidence at the American inquiry that it was not common practice to stop or even slow down in ice fields, because dangerous icebergs, I don't mean tiny ones, but the bigger icebergs were so visible, even in foggy conditions, that they were so visible and thus avoidable even at normal cruising speeds. So it wasn't now normal practice. Now, this at the inquiry, the evidence given by Captain Lord of the Californian, who, by the way, became the scapegoat for the disaster, but again, I'll come on to that in a little bit more detail later on. He said that he'd stopped in the ice field because it was too dangerous to continue. Well, that is just utter nonsense. Now, the shipping line that the Californian belonged to was called the Red Star Line, and it was part of JP Morgan's shipping line portfolio. JP Morgan's shipping interests were called International Mercantile Marine, and both Red Star Line and White Star Line came under the same umbrella. So JP Morgan was the boss of both those 2 ships, in effect, even though they were slightly different shipping lines.
Was there a reason why they had to go through these ice fields, or is it?
Yeah. I mean, this is a problem in spring. Early to late spring. there are always icebergs. You
Okay.
can't avoid them. Okay, but this particular ice field was, yeah, it was quite a large ice field, and but again, the Titanic actually, the captain of Titanic allegedly made a mistake, so we're told, and he turned west towards New York 10 miles too soon. If he'd have sailed 10 miles further on, going southwest, and then turned west, he would have avoided the ice field altogether. And he must have known this. They must have known this. You know, these people did have that information. And but in actual fact, he made that error, as I say, you know, in quote marks. Was it an error? Who knows? But it certainly fits in with the with the facts of the real story. So, I mean, the other thing about it was, of course, that Titanic's turning circle was such that it should have easily been able to spot the iceberg in good time and avoid it. But officially it wasn't spotted until it was, again, quote, too late. But in reality, it was actually seen 4 miles away, which, of course, is all rather strange if you believe the official story. Now, I'm not absolutely convinced that it hit the iceberg at all. Okay, I know there were many eyewitness accounts of all the ice on the decks, and there was copious amounts, big chunks of ice all over the deck when it actually stopped. But what happened was, as soon as the incident, whatever the incident was, if there was an incident occurred, they immediately slammed the engines into reverse. Now, it was a very cold night, very cold night. And there would have been copious amounts of ice all over the rigging, all over the wireless aerial, which the wireless aerial stretched the entire length of the ship. Mm-hmm. And lots of, you know, deck buildings, and they would have been covered in ice. So thrusting the engines abruptly into reverse would have had the natural effect of shaking loose large amounts of ice from these miles of overhead rigging. And the other piece of evidence that says that it didn't actually hit an iceberg is that in the policy, the company policy was for White Star Line was to all the front two lifeboats were always swung out over the edge of the rails, the deck rails, so that this was in case of man overboard or something like that. So it was to enable them to quickly launch a boat to rescue someone who fell into the sea. So the front one on the port side and the front one on the starboard side were swung out. Now, we know that both those lifeboats were used in the rescue, so neither of them were damaged. If Titanic had grazed an iceberg on the starboard side, which is what the story says, then that lifeboat that was swung out over the edge would either have been destroyed or knocked off completely. Well, it wasn't. We know that. It was totally undamaged. So again, it's another piece of circumstantial evidence to say that there was no iceberg. I actually believe that it was either rammed by another ship, which was designed to create a gash in the ship, or that they just opened the sluices and scuttled her deliberately. The damage that we're told that happened to Titanic was quite strange in a way, because but nobody's ever seen it. This is the problem. It's that part of the ship that was damaged is up to its neck in silt, at the bottom of the sea. So the puncture, the alleged hole in the side is just not visible. So, but we're told from White Star employees at the time that the steel plates had a 15 centimeter, which is about a 6 inch, 6 inch wide puncture, that some places penetrated 5 feet into the ship, and the gash was 300 foot long. So they're asking us to believe that a piece of ice can create a 6 inch wide gash that penetrates 5 foot into the ship and is 300 feet long. Now, that just doesn't ring true to me. I mean, I know that packed ice is very, very strong, and in some cases it's stronger, can be stronger than steel. But it would have needed a really bizarrely shaped outcrop of ice on an iceberg to achieve that kind of damage. And anything of that shape would surely have snapped off in contact with steel. But of course it didn't, because it was 300 foot long, so it couldn't have snapped off. Right, so okay, that's where we're up to so far. We're making good progress, but there's still a lot to cover. Okay,
Certainly.
now in my book, RMS Olympic, and I've touched on this already, describe an intrinsic connection between the sinking of the Titanic and the formation of the Federal Reserve Bank in the US in 1913. Now in 1910, just winding back the clock a couple of years now, 7 prominent men representing various financial interests met totally incognito at a place called Jekyll Island, which is off the coast of Georgia, to hatch a plan to usurp the power to create money from the American government. And the result of this was to be the Federal Reserve Bank, which in UK terms, it's equivalent to the Bank of England. It's the central bank, the bank that is responsible for creating a country's currency. However, this wasn't without strong opposition from certain mega rich people. And of course, one of the prime movers behind the Federal Reserve was a certain Mr. J.P. Morgan. You know, so yes, as I said, he also owned the White Star Line, plus many other financial interests. But there were 4 extremely wealthy men who were totally opposed to the Federal Reserve Plan, and they were leading the opposition. These guys were John Jacob Astor, who was widely known as the richest man in the world at the time, a guy called Ben Guggenheim, who was an American industrialist, a guy called Isidor Straus, who owned Macy's department store and had financial interests in lots of banks. And the 4th member of the team was a guy called Charles Lindbergh Sr., who was a congressman. Charles Lindbergh Sr. was the father of Charles Lindbergh, the famous flyer who flew the Atlantic solo. Okay, so this was his father, not flyer. And the reason that they opposed the Federal Reserve plans was not through any altruism on behalf of the common people, but because they knew what the Federal Reserve Plan was all about. It would bring soaring inflation and inbuilt debt, national debt, and that would severely impact their own fortunes. Because after all, I think everyone knows that inflation is kind of a hidden tax, isn't it? Because
it most certainly is.
Yeah, if you've got a few million sat in the bank, which these guys did have, then you know it's going to have a severe impact on their own fortunes. So they created this strong resistance movement on the East Coast, which was beginning to win the battle against the Federal Reserve conspirators. Now, interestingly, 3 of those men died on the Titanic. Coincidence? Well, only 5% of first-class passengers died, and these 3 men were part of that 5%. Okay.
And they were amongst some of the wealthiest people on Earth, right? Because to your point, with all the other first-class passengers and most of them getting off, you would think that the wealthiest ones would be the first ones that are setting foot in the lifeboat.
The very first ones.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they all died under very mysterious circumstances. We are told that John Astor was living under a cloud at that point in time because he divorced his wife, and that was a terrible thing to do in those days. And he'd taken up with a young girl who was actually younger than his son. Okay, so she was only 19 years old, and he was well into his 40s. So there was a bit of a scandal going on at the time. Now, and she was pregnant at this time as well, by the way. So he put her in a lifeboat and then tried to climb into the lifeboat himself, and he wasn't allowed. Okay, because it was only women and children, allegedly. They were allowed to enter lifeboats because there weren't enough lifeboats. Well, I think everyone knows that. So he just apparently wandered off into the crowd and never seen again. Isidor Straus and his wife, again, similar kind of thing happened. They both tried to get into the lifeboat. They'd only allow her in. So he said, okay, no worries, I'll you know, I won't get in. And then she decided to get out because she didn't want to leave him. And so they allegedly went back to their cabins and just waited there to die on their own, which is all very convenient. And the other guy, Ben Guggenheim, The Apocryphal Story, and again, it's shown in quite a few of the films and documentaries. He allegedly dressed up in his best morning suit, and he went into the smoking lounge and sat there and waited to die. He didn't even attempt to escape, apparently. And the famous quote that he's alleged to have made was, "I'm dressed up in my best and prepared to go down like a gentleman," which is all very romantic and very convenient, isn't it? Yeah. So, the point I was making about the big fuss and fanfare that was made about the Titanic, and which, you know, this hyped up maiden voyage, which I believe was done deliberately by Morgan, was to facilitate, you know, all the rich and famous being lured onto it, you know, with the idea of disposing of those three specifically. Interestingly enough, Morgan mysteriously failed to show at Southampton docks in time for the departure of the ship, along with around 50 of his friends and colleagues.
Oh, talk about convenient.
Yeah. And he also had all his he'd bought he'd been in Europe, he'd bought a lot of ancient art treasures, some from Egypt as well, and he had all those removed about an hour before the ship sailed as well. So yeah, it's all looking very suspicious. So how was the accident facilitated, and how did they expect to pull off the deception? Well, they almost succeeded in pulling off the deception, and let's face it, it's only recently when, you know, investigators such as myself have been able to pull the official story to pieces by meticulous research. So obviously it wasn't an accident. You know, I believe that Stanley Lord, who was the captain of the Californian, was in on the plot. As I said, Red Star Line, to which it belonged, was also owned by J.P. Morgan. Now, interestingly enough, Lord's background is quite fascinating, because several years previously, Lord had been responsible for successfully evacuating 2,000 people from a ship in under an hour as part of a military exercise. So he was the perfect man for the job, wasn't he? I think it was the intention to save most of the passengers, to be fair, and allow a select few to become victims to cover up the disposal of the Federal Reserve conspirators. So the idea was that California would be standing by, as I say, in the ice field, complete with her 3,000 blankets and 3,000 sweaters to pick up most of the survivors. Several passengers said afterwards, independently, and again, these are in contemporary newspaper reports, that they'd been told by White Star Line staff not to worry, the Californian was on its way to pick them up. Yet, it's easily provable that Californian was totally incommunicado, sat 19 miles away with its wireless switched off and beyond visible contact. And there'd been no communications between Californian and Titanic at all at that point, or indeed ever, you know, according to the Marconi wireless transcripts, which I've examined in detail. In fact, I'm lying there a little bit, because there was a communication. Captain Lord sent 3 personal messages to Captain Smith of the Titanic, giving their location. Why would he do that? Why would Captain Smith of the Titanic need to know the location of the Californian? Just doesn't make any sense.
So it sounds like Captain Smith and the Titanic crew may have been betrayed.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I believe so. But it's also, as I said, it's also uncertain as to whether she actually hit an iceberg. Possibly, if it did, it was deliberately steered into one. Maybe it was sunk by explosives or another ship. We don't know, and probably we never will know.
Well, is there any, you know, if you were going to hit an iceberg, you would imagine that the damage would go inward, right? And so was there evidence that the damage went inward, or was there any evidence that was the opposite, where you saw the damage going outward?
This is the problem. Nobody's ever seen the damage on the starboard side, which was alleged. On the port side, on the wreck, there is what looks like the result of an explosion, because I think this is maybe what you're referring to, is it? Because the plates are buckled outwards. It looks like one of the boilers probably exploded in contact when it came in contact with the icy cold water.
Oh, gotcha.
So that would explain that, but that's actually on the port side of the ship. So the damage that we're talking about was on the starboard side, the right-hand side of the ship as you're looking forward. Yeah. Now, there was one eyewitness also, again, this is all documented, one eyewitness swore that at the time of the accident, he'd seen a ship with yellow funnels. Okay, we call them funnels in the UK. I believe you call them smokestacks over there.
All right.
Which was known as the yellow funnel steamer. Okay, that became known as the yellow funneled steamer mystery. And he saw this ship directly alongside, and I mean absolutely adjacent to the ship at the side of the incident. And this ship was also seen by crew members of the Californian, sailing away into the distance after the event. And indeed, when the Carpathia, which was the ship that rescued all the passengers who were floating in the lifeboats, all the survivors, when the Carpathia picked them up, they actually found another lifeboat which was seen floating there that was of a different color and design to those of Titanic. And of course, we know how many lifeboats the Titanic had. 16.
Yep.
What was it, 24? No, can't remember. But there was one extra lifeboat. So where did that come from? Again, circumstantial evidence.
Right.
So what happened was Carpathia picked up all the survivors around 3 hours after the ship foundered, because the Californian never switched on its wireless for whatever reason, best known to Captain Lord and his crew, and we'll never know the reason for it. But they never actually answered Titanic's distress signals, even though it was only 19 miles away at the time. Okay, so there were 705 survivors out of 2,200. Now, Carpathia, interestingly enough, it sailed at full speed from wherever it was. It was the only one that was near enough to respond at all, and it took it 3 hours to get there. It was about 50-something miles away when it received the distress signal. But Carpathia was fitted out like a hospital ship and had got 7 doctors on board. You know, so that, again, that's another strange anomaly, an inexplicable anomaly. What was all that about? And you know, talking about the inquiries, both inquiries were thought at the time to be whitewashers. There were no witnesses from the passenger contingent called at all. No witnesses were allowed to give personal evidence, and they were strictly forbidden from speaking other than to give simple answers to direct questions without elaboration. And when questioned by the press afterwards, Captain Lord of the California said, and I quote, "I am not allowed to give out state secrets. You will have to ask those in the office." So what on earth does that mean?
Wow.
Yeah. Now there's lots of other bits of information here. When the surviving crew members got back to England 2 weeks after the disaster, they were all illegally detained overnight in a holding pen in Plymouth docks, and was on the south coast of England, without access to any legal or union representation. I believe that's what's known as kidnapping. And they were coerced into signing a document that they believed was something known as the Official Secrets Act. Now, the Official Secrets Act, during the run-in to World War I, had been devised to stop people who worked in industries such as shipping from speaking about what was happening, because they were building up to war already at this point in time. They knew there was a war coming. So anybody that worked in any sensitive industry had to sign this Official Secrets Act, and that's what they believed they were signing. So, as I say, did she really hit an iceberg? There were only 5 eyewitnesses. William Murdoch, who was the first officer, the 2 lookouts in the crow's nest, the helmsman, the guy who steered the thing, and 1 other ordinary seaman. And significantly, Murdoch actually committed suicide in the aftermath of the collision, leaving as the only witnesses 4 working class guys, and how easy would it be to keep them quiet through threats to their and their families' future livelihoods. So was Titanic set up by Captain Smith on the orders of J.P. Morgan? And we talked about this briefly earlier, to enter an ice field at high speed with the intent of ramming her with this steamer, which could well have been an icebreaker of some kind, in order to provide a plausible cover story, kill two birds with one stone and collect the insurance payout for the wrecked Olympic, and also to rid the Federal Reserve conspirators of their powerful enemies. There were 6 significant deaths, I believe: Captain Smith, Chief Officer Wilde, First Officer Murdoch, who I've just mentioned, all of whom I suspect to have been privy to the plan, plus Guggenheim, Strauss, and Astor. There's no real eyewitness evidence of what happened to any of them, but as I say, according to the official legend, none of them attempted to escape. Captain Smith allegedly decided to go down with the ship. Murdoch shot himself. Why? So, you know, as I say, it's highly significant to me that Guggenheim, Astor, and Strauss were all well known to be opponents of the Federal Reserve plans, and significantly, they were also the most well known of the victims. As I said, very few of whom were first-class passengers. So the upshot of it all was that Morgan got his insurance payout. The Federal Reserve Bank bail came to pass the following year with little to no resistance. And this then enabled the elite to begin the next phase of their grand plan in 1914 and engineer the outbreak of World War I, because they used the money that was generated by the Federal Reserve. Because, you know, for anyone out there who doesn't understand how central banks work, they create money out of thin air, thus providing them with the funds to fund the arms race that was going on at that point in time, and actually fund the war itself. Now, you know, World War I had been planned as early as 1890. I know that sounds crazy to some people, but obviously they needed finance. I won't go into the details of that because it's not relevant at this point, but finance was needed for it, obviously. And as I say, the Federal Reserve provided that. Now, interestingly, the British Liberal government of that day, it was the Liberal Party that was in power, and the Prime Minister was a guy called Herbert Asquith. I believe they were all complicit in this scheme, because they knew that if Olympic had to be scrapped, then Harland and Wolff and White Star would have gone too. And it's almost certain that Morgan would have cut his losses, pulled out, and exercised his rights as the main creditor to repossess all the ships. What's significant about that is that that Morgan was only given permission to own the White Star Line, because at that point in time, rightly or wrongly, I don't know the whys and wherefores of it particularly, but foreign nationals were not allowed to own British shipping lines. Now, I believe that Morgan somehow came to an agreement with the government to say that in the event of war breaking out, as part of his deal for being able to buy the company, it would allow them to be used as troop carriers. But had White Star Line gone bust, Morgan, as main creditor, would have kept the ships, and the government would have lost their troop ships. And of course, as I say, at this point in time, they all knew it was going on. But more importantly, the damage to the British economy, the unemployment figures, 30,000 alone at Harland and Wolff, similar number at White Star, several more thousand in associated dependent industries, then there is no chance that the Liberals would have got back into power again. So I believe it was an expedient used by the government to make sure that, you know, they kept power. Okay, now let's go back to the propeller mentioned that I said I would talk about later.
You said one was borrowed.
Well, that's right. Yeah. One was borrowed from the incomplete Titanic.
Well, and this is all significant because you know, if it was truly the Titanic that sank, a lot of the things that you're talking about, or some of the things you're talking about, perhaps people are like, well, you know, maybe it's not as plausible, but when you incorporate that it may have been the Olympic.
Yeah.
And to your point, the significance of the Federal Reserve System and the control that gives the very elite wealthy people. Once you start to get your arms around that, this becomes a very, very, very believable thing.
Absolutely. And also bear in mind, guys, and everyone out there, that I am barely scratching the surface here. This is only the very basic story.
Yep.
You know, the entire sordid operation is laid out in much, much greater detail in the book.
Yep.
You know, so anybody who's interested in following it up, then buy a copy of RMS Olympic, because, you know, it completely details everything in much more, you know, with much more detail.
Sure.
Yeah.
So the propeller was damaged, right? Right.
Yeah, the propeller. Now, opponents of this hypothesis, shall we say that, well, and this is true, they say that, well, you can clearly see on the propeller that was replaced, the build number 401, and that was absolutely Titanic's build number. And yet we're alleging that this is the Olympic on the bottom of the sea. But this is where the propeller switch comes into play, because we know that they took the propeller from the unfinished Titanic. This is not even up for question. So they took the propeller off and it had the build number 401, which was Titanic. Olympic's build number was 400. So the stamp of 401 can be absolutely, totally explained by the fact that the propeller was swapped. So, you know,
so we have the Olympic then that survived the whole story.
Yeah.
Damage beyond repair. So did that become a museum, or what was the fate of the Olympic?
Well, the Olympic, which was really the Titanic,
right? Yeah.
Plied its trade across the Atlantic for the next 25 years. I mean, and then given the damage,
miraculous recovery.
Sorry.
A miraculous recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, given the damage that we know that it had, there is no way. I mean, you know, in winter, the Atlantic is absolutely the punishment that ships take in the North Atlantic. You know, during the winter, especially when, you know, during the storm season, just amazing. I mean, they get battered, absolutely battered. There's no way that would have been able to survive for 25 years. You know, that's okay. So they declare it a wreck, and then it's in service for another 25 years. I don't think so. So.
Well, and on the propeller, you mentioned that one of them says 401, which was Titanic. Did the other two say 400? Is that visible?
Well, we don't know. We can only see that one.
Ah, gotcha. So that's the only one visible. So you're not, but that is easy.
Yeah, all that's
doing
doing
explainable, right?
Yeah, all that's doing is explaining to the people who don't believe this hypothesis, because it's got 401 build number on it, is that, well, yeah, it's got 401 build number on it because they took the one from Titanic.
Yep.
So it's quite a simple little but okay, and we're kind of nearly there now. But one of the other things that I discovered during my research was that it was actually a common scam in those days to switch ships' identities. You know, to, you know, any ship that was badly damaged and you know, they couldn't claim the insurance payout. You know, it was a common scam to do it, apparently. You know, now, interestingly as well, this is another little kind of addendum to this sordid story. There was a crew member by the name of Lewis Klein, who was a witness, or was meant to be a witness at the American inquiry. Now, Lewis Klein was, his name has been totally removed from all the crew lists right now, but we know for an absolute fact that he existed and he was on board, because he actually made a statement which was read out at the American inquiry. You know, it was he was actually forced to write an affidavit, which was written into the as testimony, which was written into the transcript of the American inquiry. Now, what he has to say is quite interesting. If you don't mind, it's quite a long quote, but I'm going to read this out because I think this is quite significant. Right. He said, quote, "There was a ball following a banquet of some kind going on down below when I went up on watch at 9:30, and the captain and the officers were there with many passengers. After the party, the stewards sent the champagne and wines that were left over to the crew. I know that many of them were drunk. A passenger standing at the rail saw something dead ahead, or maybe a little to the starboard. Look, quick, see the hill over there. I saw it was a big iceberg and ran for the bridge. The third officer was coming and yelped to me to ask what the matter was. I couldn't stop to answer, I was too excited. I ran for the spar with the crow's nest on it, and I shouted to the lookout I knew was up there to give the alarm. Not a word did I hear, so I started up the spar. It was less than a minute after I left the promenade deck that I got to the top of the spar and found both lookouts fast asleep. I rang the alarm bell myself. Now that is in the transcript of the American inquiry, and yet it wasn't even discussed. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'll admit I can't begin to imagine where that all fits into the story,
Right.
but it's just an interesting aside, if you like. Now let's talk a little bit about we are nearly there now, but let's just talk a little bit about the insurance scam. Now, Titanic cost $2.5 million to build, which was about $10 million in those days. Obviously that is hundreds of millions of dollars these days.
Yep.
It was $10 million at the time. Now, so the badly damaged Olympic was uninsurable. White Star Line normally insured their ships for 75% of the value. So the payout for Titanic would have been about $7.5 million. In fact, the insurance on Titanic was upped the week before the maiden voyage to just under $13 million. And this was paid out within a week of the disaster. Now, imagine you making a claim on your home insurance for, I don't know, some red wine spilled on a carpet. They would take weeks, and they'd argue with you why they shouldn't pay you out. And yet this $13 million, which was kind of, knocking on for $500 million in today's money, they paid it out within a week.
Yeah, if you try to, anybody who's filed a home claim
Exactly.
and knows that it is an arduous process
Exactly.
to get any money paid at all, let alone this. It is not a quick, expeditious situation.
No. And the fact that the insurance was upped, what does that remind you of, guys? A certain date in September 2001, when
Right.
a certain Mr. Silverstein quadrupled his terrorist attack insurance on two rather large structures in New York. It's exactly the same scenario.
Kind of convenient, right?
Yeah.
To be continued for another episode.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, as I say, it's all, much of it is circumstantial, but at the end of the day, what you have to understand is that circumstantial evidence is acceptable in court as long as it's strong enough circumstantial evidence. So, there are certain elements to it that prove that the official story is nonsense. But to be fair, I have kind of extrapolated some of this stuff, but I'm certainly not telling any lies. It's all absolutely verifiable in terms of documented records, if you like. So yeah, I mean, there's loads and loads of other bits of info that I could go into, but I don't want to kind of.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. Well, no, you've given us a lot of great information, and I know even one of the things you mentioned in the beginning was just some of the photographs, and just even looking through some of the work that you put together in that book, you can clearly see that a lot of the photographs that have been taken, the portholes and things of that nature, line up with Olympic and not Titanic. So, it's just one of those things where as you start to peel back the onion on history, and we've talked extensively about this and read a lot of your work, this being one of those works, it is incredibly important to understand where some of the things, where some of the things that we've been taught to be true might not be as true as we thought. And when would you want to know that information, especially with dealing with what we're dealing with right now in the world, where so much is happening and there's so much disinformation that, all right, we're, looking back, this is not a new thing, and that's why we wanted to do this project with you, is because this is indeed not a new thing. Propaganda and spinning the truth is something that's been done for a very long time.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
this is just the tip of the iceberg, no pun intended, of us trying to peel back the onion and say, all right, well, where are all these other areas that we've been deceived? And maybe that can start to get people to realize that deception has never stopped.
Exactly.
And so, John, I know that we're up against our time, and I greatly appreciate you being on and talking about this subject matter, because Titanic has always been something that's been fascinating to me. We've all seen the movies, to your point.
Yeah.
It's been one of those nostalgic things that a lot of us here in the States, and it's probably like this in other areas too, that it it just makes you wonder, like, is that what really happened? And obviously with some of the things you said, it is highly likely that it happened much differently than what you're telling us. What do you have any final words on this topic that you'd like to share, just as kind of wrapping things up with Titanic and Olympic?
No, not specifically. I mean, there are lots of other minor details that I've left out, for reasons of time. I think I may have said to you at one point, I actually did a 4-hour podcast on Titanic and still didn't cover it all.
Wow.
That was a good few years ago. So there is a lot more to know, and it is an even more compelling story when you get the full range of information.
Well, where can they find RMS Olympic?
On Amazon.
Okay.
Amazon.com. Yeah. If you go to my author page, just go to the search bar and type in John Hamer. It'll take you to my author page where all my books are, and RMS Olympic. There's also anybody who's interested in novels. There is also my only ever likely to be attempt at writing a novel called Titanic's Last Secret. Now, Titanic's Last Secret is just a novel based on the RMS Olympic book. So again, gotcha. I don't know whether I mentioned this to you guys, but in 2013, I was invited over to Hollywood to try and raise finance to make a film about my version of the story by a Hollywood film director. We went around a few producers. Did I tell you this story before?
Yeah,
you did, and you mentioned basically you got soaked for information at the end of the day,
Yeah, and that's how the two books came about, actually, because we got nowhere at all. Went to see a few producers, and but one guy said, "Oh, it's got to be based on a book," So I went and wrote RMS Olympic, and they said, "No, it's got to be a novel." So then I wrote Titanic's Last Secret, and that's how the two books came about.
Well, I haven't read the second one, but I have read the RMS Olympic, and I will tell you, if anybody out there listening right now loves mystery stories, it is amazing mystery because there's so much evidence that points towards deception. It's staggering, and when you look at it in the context of the Federal Reserve, and we hope to get into that subject as well, because that
makes complete sense.
It makes all the sense in the world. So, well, with that said, just thanks everyone for tuning in. Like I said, this is the first episode of the H-Files, and we're very excited about this project. And this was a great topic to discuss because it's something that's historic, and in learning about all this stuff now makes you want to look back at other things, which is what we're going to go do. So we're going to try to strive to rediscover some of our lost history, which is going to be a lot of fun. And John, I know that you're going to be up for the challenge. So I guess until next time, God bless everybody out there. Have a great evening, and we'll see you soon.
Great stuff. Thanks everyone for listening.